The day had started like any other for the advanced alien race, the Zorathians. Their ships glided smoothly through the stars, their engines humming with the kind of power that made other civilizations tremble. Their technology was unmatched. Their weapons could obliterate entire planets with a single command. They believed they were superior to all life forms in the galaxy, and this belief fueled their exploration of new worlds. Earth was one of those worlds they had often observed from a distance, but they had never considered it worth investigating until now. A mission was launched, not to conquer or destroy, but to study. The Zorathians thought of humans as little more than insects, primitive creatures struggling to survive. They had never seen any reason to fear them, but things went horribly wrong. It started with a small mistake. A ship from their fleet had malfunctioned, crashing onto Earth in a remote forest far from civilization. The crew inside the ship was injured, but they were still alive. The Zorathians saw this as a minor inconvenience. After all, they had technology that could easily fix anything. They sent a small team to retrieve the wreckage and salvage anything useful. However, what they hadn't counted on was the presence of a human child. The child, no more than 10 years old, had been playing in the woods when the crash occurred. The noise had startled them, but curiosity had led the child to investigate. As they approached the wreckage, they saw the aliens emerging from the ship, their tall, imposing forms towering above them. The child froze, unsure of what to do, but fear wasn't something they had ever known, at least not in the way these aliens would come to understand it. The child didn't scream or run away. Instead, they simply stood there, wide-eyed and full of wonder. The Zorathians, who had never interacted with humans before, were taken aback. They had seen creatures on other planets react to their presence with fear, but this child didn't seem scared. This intrigued them, but it was a mistake to underestimate the strength of something so small. They approached the child slowly, the leader of the group, a tall alien with silvery skin, calling out to them in a language that should have been understood by all, but it wasn't. The child didn't understand. And so, with a simple decision, the leader ordered the child to be taken. They needed to study this human, to understand how it could be so different from the other life forms they had encountered. Perhaps there was something unique about them, something they could use. The child was small, weak compared to them, and they saw no reason not to take them as a specimen for observation. The Zorathians had little regard for human life. After all, they believed humans were nothing more than insects. The child, now captured, was placed in a small, confined cell on their ship. The Zorathians didn't believe in the need for comfort, so the cell was cold and uninviting. They restrained the child with high-tech bonds, the kind that could hold even the strongest of beings. They tried to communicate with the child, but the language barrier was a problem. However, that didn't stop the Zorathians from beginning their experiments. They were curious. They wanted to see what made humans tick. How did their minds work? How did their bodies endure the harsh conditions of their world? They didn't expect much from a creature so small and fragile. But they were wrong. The child, though terrified at first, refused to show weakness. The Zorathians had underestimated them, assuming that fear would break the human spirit. But they didn't realize that there was a fire in the child's heart, a strength that came from something far deeper than any of their tests could measure. The child refused to cry out when they were subjected to their first round of tests. They did not beg for mercy. Instead, they gritted their teeth, determined not to show the aliens the fear they sought. The Zorathians were puzzled. They had never seen a being react like this before. Most creatures would have given in by now. The child's body was small, fragile even, yet it seemed to endure every test they threw at it without breaking. They had expected to find weakness, but instead, they found something they didn't understand: resilience. Days turned into weeks as the Zorathians conducted their experiments. They tried everything they could think of, testing the child's endurance, studying their physiology, even attempting to manipulate their emotions with various devices. But the child remained strong, refusing to reveal anything about themselves. It was as though they were more than just human. They were something else entirely. Something the Zorathians hadn't accounted for. As the days went on, the child began to learn. They started to understand their surroundings and what the Zorathians were trying to do. At first, they had been afraid, but as the tests continued, the child grew smarter, more resourceful. They began to study their captors, learning their routines, their weaknesses. The Zorathians, for all their superior technology, had never considered that a human child might be capable of adapting and fighting back. One night, after another round of experiments, the child noticed something. The Zorathians had left one of their doors slightly ajar, a mistake they had made in their haste. The child saw an opportunity. They had no idea how they would escape, but the instinct to survive kicked in. The child didn't hesitate. They crawled toward the open door, careful not to make a sound. The moment they stepped into the corridor, they felt something shift in the air. The Zorathians were watching. They had always been watching. The leader's voice echoed through the ship, calling out for the child's capture. But it was too late. The child had already begun to run. The ship that had once seemed like an impenetrable fortress suddenly felt vulnerable. The Zorathians realized, too late, that they had underestimated the child. They had thought of the human as weak, but now they realized that the human was far more than they had bargained for. The Zorathians scrambled to contain the child, but the damage had already been done. The child had already become something far greater than they could have imagined, a symbol of human strength. And as they fled into the depths of the ship, the child's heart raced, not from fear, but from the certainty that they were no longer just a captive. They were a force to be reckoned with. The Zorathians had made a grave mistake. They had dared to hurt a human child. And now, they would pay the ultimate price. The child's journey had just begun. The Zorathians, for all their power, had no idea what they had unleashed. The Zorathians had always prided themselves on their intelligence and technological advancements. But they had never understood one simple truth. Never underestimate a human, especially one with the heart of a fighter. As the days passed, they tried to regain control over their situation, but it quickly became clear that they were facing an adversary they hadn't prepared for. The child, who had once been a helpless captive, was now more than just a prisoner. They were a living, breathing symbol of something the Zorathians had never seen before: human resilience. The child's escape wasn't just a physical one. It was a shift in the balance of power. The Zorathians had believed they were the masters of the universe, able to conquer and manipulate any species they encountered. But here they were, trapped by a small human child who, despite their size and apparent fragility, had proven to be far stronger than they could have ever imagined. The child had no weapons, no advanced technology, but they had something the Zorathians couldn't fathom: sheer determination. As the child darted through the narrow hallways of the Zorathian ship, they could hear the aliens' frantic voices over their communication systems. They were searching, calling out commands, but there was a fear in their voices now, a fear that had not been there before. The child could sense it. It was the same fear that all animals feel when they realize they are no longer at the top of the food chain. The child had learned quickly. The ship was like a maze to someone so small, but they had watched the Zorathians' movements, learned their routines, and now, with the help of their sharp mind, they had a chance to escape. The child had been silent for so long, enduring test after test, never letting the Zorathians see their fear. But now, with every step they took deeper into the heart of the ship, they felt a fire burning inside them. They weren't running away, they were running toward freedom, and they knew they were going to make it. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind them. The child froze, their heart pounding in their chest. The Zorathians were getting closer. Panic threatened to take over, but the child pushed it down. They could not afford to be caught. Not now. Not after everything they had endured. The Zorathians had underestimated how resourceful a human could be. They had assumed that the child would eventually break, that the pain would force them to give up. But they didn't know that humans had an incredible ability to withstand hardship, to keep going even when there seemed to be no hope. The child had lived through the worst kind of pain already, and yet, here they were, still fighting, still surviving. With one last burst of energy, the child dashed into a small maintenance room, slamming the door behind them. The Zorathians would find it soon enough, but they needed a few moments to regroup. The child pressed their back against the cold metal wall, listening to the voices outside the door, wondering if they would be found. But then, something inside them shifted. They realized something important. They weren't alone. The Zorathians had made one fatal mistake. They had assumed that the human child was weak and helpless. But what they hadn't considered was that humanity's strength wasn't just physical. The child's mind, sharp and quick, was as strong as their body, and with every test the Zorathians threw at them, they had become smarter, more cunning. The child was not just a prisoner, they were a force to be reckoned with. Outside the door, the Zorathians were still searching, but the child had already made a plan. They had learned enough about the ship's layout to know where the weakest points were, and they knew that if they could get to the control room, they might be able to disable the ship's systems. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only chance they had. With a deep breath, the child pushed the door open just a crack, peering out into the hallway. The coast was clear. They slipped out of the room and started moving toward the rear of the ship, their footsteps light and quick. They had no time to waste. The deeper they went into the ship, the more the child felt the weight of what they were doing. They weren't just running away, they were fighting for something much bigger. They were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for all the humans who had ever been underestimated, for every person who had ever been treated as insignificant. The child wasn't just a victim anymore. They were a symbol of what humanity could achieve when pushed to the edge. As they reached the control room, the child's heart raced. This was it. They had to act quickly. They slipped inside the room, using the small knowledge they had gained from observing the Zorathian systems. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when they almost gave up, but the child refused to stop. The thought of those aliens, those powerful beings who had hurt them, kept pushing them forward. Finally, after what felt like hours, the child reached the control panel. They didn't know exactly what to do, but they knew enough to press the right buttons to initiate the system shutdown. It wasn't long before the ship's engines began to sputter, and the lights in the control room flickered. The Zorathians had underestimated not just the child, but the entire human spirit. For the first time since the crash, the child allowed themselves a moment of relief. They had done it. The ship was no longer under the aliens' control, but their mission was far from over. The child still had to escape. The Zorathians would be coming for them soon. As the ship began to drift, the child made their way back to the docking bay. They had no weapons, no backup, and no idea how they would survive once they were outside, but they knew one thing for sure: they would fight. They had survived so much already. What was a little more danger? With the ship in chaos, the Zorathians had no idea what was coming next. They had underestimated the human child, thinking they were nothing more than a specimen to study. Now, they would pay the price for their arrogance. The child wasn't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for every human who had ever been treated as weak, as inferior. The Zorathians had made a grave mistake. They had hurt a human child. And now they would learn that humans were not to be trifled with. The battle had only just begun, and the child, determined and fearless, was ready to face whatever came next. The Zorathians were in a state of panic, scrambling to regain control of their ship. The child had set the ship into chaos, and now the once impenetrable fortress was a crumbling wreck. The Zorathian leaders, who had always prided themselves on their superior intelligence and technology, were now scrambling to salvage what they could, but the damage was done. The child, who had once been a captive, was now the instigator of a revolt they had never anticipated. The Zorathians had underestimated the child. They had thought of them as weak, fragile, and easy to control. They had believed that their superior technology and power would be enough to subdue a human. But what they hadn't counted on was the unbreakable will of a human, especially one who had nothing left to lose. The child, exhausted but determined, made their way through the ship. The corridors were a maze, and every corner could hide an enemy. But the child wasn't afraid anymore. They had faced so much already: torture, fear, and isolation, that nothing could shake their resolve now. They had fought through it all, and now they were on the brink of something far greater than escape. They were leading a rebellion. The Zorathians had their soldiers, their weapons, and their vast knowledge of the galaxy. But they didn't have the one thing that could make or break a battle: unity. They had no idea that the child had already sparked something. As the child moved through the ship, they noticed something strange. Other humans were beginning to act. The ones who had been captured, the ones who had been kept in cells, isolated and forgotten. Now they were starting to stir. The Zorathians were so focused on the child that they failed to see the growing rebellion among the humans. It started small, a few murmurs here and there, but soon the prisoners were organizing. The Zorathians had always assumed they could control the humans, but the truth was, the humans were starting to fight back, and they were doing it in ways the Zorathians couldn't comprehend. The child was not alone anymore. The people who had been caged like animals, who had been treated as if their lives meant nothing, were now rising up. They had been inspired by the child's bravery, by the courage shown in the face of insurmountable odds. They had seen that the Zorathians could be defeated. They had seen that humanity, when pushed to its limits, could rise like a storm, unstoppable and fierce. The Zorathians, who had believed they could crush this rebellion with ease, were now facing a war on two fronts. They were battling the humans who had started fighting back, and they were fighting against the realization that their own system was crumbling beneath them. The child, who had once been the victim, was now the leader of this uprising, the beacon of hope for all who had been oppressed. The battle for control of the ship escalated quickly. The Zorathians tried to deploy their forces, but their once perfect tactics were failing. The human prisoners had learned how to use their surroundings to their advantage, how to sabotage the ship's systems, and how to outsmart their captors. The child had become a symbol of hope for them, a reminder that they could still fight, still win. As the ship descended into chaos, the child found themselves face to face with the leader of the Zorathian fleet, the alien who had ordered the child's capture in the first place. This was it, the final confrontation. The Zorathian leader, tall and imposing, stood in front of the child with a look of disbelief. They had never expected to be in this position, to be facing a human in such a situation. They had assumed that the child would be nothing more than a specimen to study, a creature to be experimented on. They had never thought that the child would become a threat. The leader's voice was cold, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. "You've cost us everything," the leader said, their voice low and dangerous. "You've turned your people against us. You've made them believe they have a chance, but you're just a child. What do you think you can do?" The child, standing small but strong in front of the towering alien, felt the weight of the words, but they didn't flinch. They knew they were just one person. But they also knew that one person could make a difference. They had already proven that. "I'm not just a child," the child said, their voice steady. "I'm a human, and humans don't give up." The Zorathian leader sneered, drawing their weapon. "You're nothing. Just a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of the galaxy." But the child wasn't afraid anymore. They had faced worse, much worse, and had come out stronger. They knew that this battle wasn't just about them. It was about every human who had ever been underestimated, every person who had ever been told they were too weak to survive. The child wasn't just fighting for their own life. They were fighting for humanity's future. With a swift movement, the child grabbed a piece of debris from the ground, using it as a makeshift weapon. The Zorathian leader lunged forward, but the child was faster, ducking out of the way and using their agility to their advantage. The Zorathian's weapon missed, hitting the wall with a loud explosion. The child wasn't just defending themselves, they were fighting for a cause. As the battle raged on, the child's courage sparked something in the other humans. The tide was turning. The Zorathians had underestimated them, but now they were seeing the consequences of their mistake. The ship that had once been the Zorathians' symbol of power was now their prison. And the child, who had once been a helpless victim, was now their worst nightmare. The battle was intense, the ship shaking under the force of the struggle. But the humans were not backing down. They were fighting with everything they had, and they were winning. The Zorathians had thought they could crush them, thought they could break their spirits, but they had forgotten one thing: the power of a human will. In the end, it was the child who delivered the final blow. With a quick strike, the child disarmed the Zorathian leader and sent them crashing to the ground. The Zorathians' reign of terror was over. As the leader fell, the child stood over them, breathing heavily but resolute. The battle had been hard, but they had won. The humans had won. The ship, once a symbol of Zorathian power, was now a symbol of humanity's strength. And as the Zorathian leader was taken away, the child knew that this was only the beginning. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. And the Zorathians would learn, too late, that humans could never be underestimated. The Zorathians were defeated, but the child knew their journey wasn't over. The battle for the ship had been won, but there was still the larger war to fight. The Zorathians, though humbled and broken, were far from extinct. Their empire stretched across the galaxy, and there were many more of their kind, far too many to be ignored. This victory was significant, but it was only the beginning. Humanity had made a statement, but now they had to prepare for the inevitable retaliation. As the dust settled on the Zorathian ship, the humans who had once been prisoners now stood alongside the child. They were battered, bruised, but alive. The ship had been disabled, its systems fried by the child's actions, but it was still functional enough to allow them to escape. However, no one was rushing to leave. The Zorathians had underestimated humans in every way possible, and now it was the humans' turn to do the unthinkable. They would not just flee, they would take the fight to the Zorathians. The child stood at the helm of the ship, the once imposing alien vessel now under human control. Their heart was racing with adrenaline, but there was a calm determination in their eyes. They weren't just leading a group of survivors anymore, they were leading an army. The child had always believed that they were just one person, but now they understood their own power. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the survival of the entire human race. They were no longer the weak, helpless beings the Zorathians had thought they were. They had proven themselves capable of standing toe-to-toe with a force that was capable of destroying entire worlds. And now, it was time to turn the tables. "Listen up," the child said, their voice steady but filled with purpose. "We've taken this ship, but it's only the first step. The Zorathians won't stop. They'll send more ships, more soldiers, and they'll try to crush us. But we won't go down. We will fight, and we will win." There was a murmur of agreement from the humans gathered around them. Many of them were still in shock, not fully understanding the magnitude of what had just happened. They had been captives for so long that the idea of fighting back seemed like a distant dream, something they could only wish for. But now, it was real. They had seen what the human spirit could do when pushed to its limits, and the child, who had once been one of them, had led them to victory. The Zorathians had made the mistake of thinking they could control humans. But now, that mistake would cost them everything. The child knew that this was the beginning of something far greater than just a single victory. This was the beginning of a revolution. The humans who had been oppressed, tortured, and enslaved were now free. But they weren't just free, they were ready to fight. The child turned to the control panel and began inputting coordinates. They knew that the ship's location was now compromised. The Zorathians would soon realize what had happened, and they would send reinforcements. But the humans had an advantage now: knowledge. They had learned about the Zorathian fleet, their tactics, their weaknesses, And they had learned something else. They were stronger together. The ship's engines hummed to life as the child navigated them away from the wreckage of the Zorathian vessel. They had only one goal now: to strike at the heart of the Zorathian Empire. The Zorathians had thought they could crush humanity, but instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant. The humans had been the underdogs, but now they were warriors. As the ship hurtled through the stars, the child stood at the helm, their mind focused on the task ahead. They weren't just a child anymore. They were a leader, a symbol of what humanity could achieve when pushed to its limits. The galaxy had underestimated them, but now it would know what they were capable of. The first step was to strike at the Zorathian homeworld. The child knew it was a dangerous mission, one that could end in failure. But failure was no longer an option. The Zorathians had taken everything from them. They had taken their families, their homes, their peace. But the humans had something the Zorathians didn't: the will to survive. And that was something the Zorathians could never take away. As the child and the newly formed resistance fleet approached the Zorathian homeworld, they couldn't help but think back on everything that had brought them to this moment. They had been the captives, the ones who were supposed to be the victims. But now, they were the ones in control. The Zorathians had thought they could break humanity, but they had only strengthened it. The child knew the war would be hard. The Zorathians had far more resources, far more ships, and far more soldiers. But they also knew something that the Zorathians didn't: the power of the human spirit. And that power was unstoppable. The battle for the Zorathian homeworld began with a series of calculated strikes against their fleet. The child, along with the rest of the human resistance, attacked the heart of the enemy's defenses, taking down key infrastructure and military installations. They fought with everything they had, refusing to let the Zorathians regain their footing. Every ship that fell, every enemy commander that was defeated, was another victory for humanity. But the Zorathians didn't give up easily. Their forces were vast, and they fought back with every weapon at their disposal. The battle was fierce, and the casualties on both sides were high. But the humans didn't falter. They fought with the knowledge that they had something the Zorathians could never have: hope. As the child led the charge into the heart of the Zorathian capital, they knew that the end was near. The Zorathians had underestimated them from the start, and now they would pay the ultimate price. The child stood tall, their eyes filled with determination. They had fought for this moment, and now it was time to see it through. With one final push, the humans overrun the Zorathian defenses. The child stood before the remains of the Zorathian leader, the one who had first ordered their capture. The alien had once looked down on them, believing that humans were weak, unworthy of attention. But now, the child stood victorious. The Zorathian Empire was no more. The humans had won. But this victory came at a cost. The child, standing amidst the ruins of their enemies, knew that the galaxy would never be the same. Humanity had proven itself, but the struggle for survival was far from over. The child had sparked a revolution, but now it was up to humanity to rebuild. The fight had been long and hard, but they had done the impossible. And as the child looked out at the stars, they knew one thing for sure: humanity would never again be underestimated.